Welcome to the Fourthstream podcast, where we are dedicated to finding hope. Many people have given up on religion, and Dave gets that. But the God story, the Bible, reveals much more than a religion. It is literally God's core statement on the issues of life and eternity. It is a series of deeply and beautifully woven threads which can take us deep into our walk with our Creator.
The last time we were together, we talked about the Bible being the first hyperlinked text. So the God story, which is what I've come to call it for myself personally, has 63,779 cross-references, and that's what this diagram shows, is that it's hyperlinked. It's all of these woven threads, which we'll talk a little bit about today. So that's kind of what led into this series of conversations. And so today I want to talk a little bit about the one woven story aspect of it, because there's a lot of confusion about the nature of the God story, the nature of the Bible. And I was thinking about this, and obviously this is a picture of a DNA strand, but and I spent a lot of time looking at what's being discovered in microbiology, macroastronomy, all of the different things that are just such great disciplines. You know, you remember from our first time together that I believe that science and philosophy and faith are all going to converge at whatever that end of the age looks like. But the idea of a woven story and having that many 67,000 connections in it, hyperlinked together, I was thinking about that when I was reading from a book by a guy named Perry Marshall. It's called Evolution 2.0. And then he talks about DNA's complexity, which I'm going to relate back to this whole idea of one woven story here in a second. If you stretched one strand of human DNA end to end, it would be 6 feet or 1.6 meters long. But it is folded into a space so small that it is literally 1 trillion times denser than any hard drive. Plus the cell easily reads it whenever necessary. How is this possible? The folding of DNA inside the nucleus of a cell is fractal. A unique mathematical pattern places folds within folds within folds so that, like your headphone cord, DNA strands don't tangle. And I was musing on that and thinking about all of the beautiful things that are being discovered through technology and through science. And I thought about this whole idea of the folding of DNA and how it makes it able to store. Now we're talking inside of a cell here. I don't know if you've done much reading about this at all, but you're probably better educated than I was when I was a kid, because they just didn't know a lot of the stuff that they know now. But that whole idea that there's such complex order to everything, right down into a molecular level, not just in human beings, but in everything that's made, in the basic units of life. That's interesting to me. And so when I think about, okay, if, I don't know how you feel about a designer, I pretty much feel like there has to be a designer. So who is that designer and what's his approach? And it seems like his approach would have something to do with what we see in science, right? Because science is an illusion, unless we make it political, but we look at the things that are made and we can see a designer in that, I think. So that makes me think about a good story. So think about the hyperlinks and think about the folds in DNA and the complexity of information, and then drawing that over and putting it into a story. I mean, how amazing, how crazy is it to do that? So I've been thinking about why this hyperlinked book, the first hyperlinked book, is such a good story. You know, what makes it so good? And a lot of people have opinions about the Bible, but they haven't necessarily ever read it. I was that way for a long period of time. But these are a few things about why it's a good story. First of all, it's interesting and it's informative. You don't just learn about a story about a guy or a woman or a family or whatever, or a group of people. It's interesting and informative in the sense that it's so foundational, so tied into the foundation of who people are, just human nature. So That makes a good story. It makes it a good story for me. Also, the nuance that's there. I mean, it's I've been studying the God story for a number of decades now, and it blows me away how every year I learn more things when I go back to these hyperlinks and I look at them and I go, oh, I'm seeing something that I didn't know. So there's nuance, and then there's order, and there are key details, and then there's the style of it. I mean, the God story isn't even written in one type of literature. It's a number of kinds. It was given to us primarily through Hebrew and Aramaic, and then obviously brought over into the Roman world. But the reality is that the style is an interesting kind of a style, and it too is woven together. I'm reading a book, or I just got done reading a book. I don't know if you read A Gentleman in Moscow. It's a great book to read, and I enjoyed it a couple of years ago. And then 6 months ago, that same author came out with another book, and it's called The Lincoln Highway. And as I read it, I was so captivated and drawn into the story and why it was a good story. And every once in a while you run across a book, you just love it, not because it agrees so much with your principles or your destination principles, but it's just well written. And that's how I feel about the Bible, if people are willing to take time. So it's also stimulating, and you have descriptive pictures and imagery because it was written in Hebrew, and then the New Testament is in Greek. English is kind of limited when you look at our language compared to the sophisticated language. So, for instance, you've run into the idea that there are 4 different major words for love in Greek, and maybe you've done some reading about this. But as you look at it, you realize that we might have one word for love. There were 4 in Greek, and so it's so full of descriptive pictures and imagery, which a lot of people miss because they never take the time to look at it, which is, by the way, called meditating, where you just kind of look and you wrestle with whatever text or whatever data you're looking at. Also, there's an aspect that makes the God story a good story because the weaving and the layering of thoughts and of concepts, and how in these amazing hyperlinks they're all woven together into a coherent and just a motivating kind of story. The God story is also challenging, but it's uncluttered. Now, you might think I'm crazy because you look at the book of Leviticus and you think, how much more cluttered could things be? But if you take a step back and look at how the story unfolded, you realize that because it's woven all together, like for instance, Old and New Testament, nowhere in the Bible does anything intimate that there's an Old and a New Testament. But you believe it, right? Our culture believes it. Theologians believe it. The church believes it, But the reality is that, where does it say it? And so I looked at that, and I looked at this good story, this woven story, and I thought, wait a minute, there's only one story. There's only one testament, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's challenging and it's uncluttered. And right along with that, it's very compelling and even life-changing, because maybe the God story has never changed your life, but if you look at history, it just keeps popping up. It's almost like there's some kind of life inside of it that is a little different than most writings of antiquity, although there are some that compare in that as well. Also, when you think about these woven threads of truth, which is kind of how I look at these hyperlinks, I see them as put together by a designer so that they can be woven together. And they're complicated, but they're simple, and they have depth. And that I'm trying to describe the multi-level layering that is found in the God story. And all of that's very thought-provoking if you jump into it, because it's really kind of an amazing thing that something can be so simple and so complex at the same time. And personally, I feel like that's what I would expect if God has spoken in history. It's going to be clear enough for me to understand it, and it's going to be complex enough for me to not always be able to comprehend it. So in these woven threads that are in the God story, some of the things that I love is capturing imagination. You know how this is, I call this scene replication. You read a good book, like the book I was just talking about the Lincoln Highway. That was several months ago. I got done with it, and I keep replaying scenes in it. And that makes something really powerful to me when it captures my imagination. And then that scene can replicate in my mind and kind of guide me through a principle or an idea or a story. So that's one aspect of the woven story that I really like, or the God story. The second one is the powerful word pictures, which I've talked about a little bit, and the mobility of the language. Because of the language that it was put into, it's so mobile in history, and it's so descriptive in history. And the word pictures, if you take the time to look at them, they're not flat. And a lot of the writings of antiquity are very flat. They're not mobile, and they're not powerful in their word pictures. And that's one of the things that really makes the God story stand out to me. And another thing that I love is that these woven threads of truth go beyond words, and they go into concepts, but they also move from words and human concepts and carry into transcendence. And it's like the perfect continuum, the perfect loop of taking us from the basic parts of who we are as people all the way up to the transcendence of whomever you perceive God to be. So I've come to the conclusion, this is my conclusion, that God is the master story weaver. And because he's the master story weaver, I think it's worth taking the time to look at what he has spoken. So a couple more things to say about my commercial here for the Bible. And when I say the Bible, I'm not talking about the religious Christianity Bible. I'm talking about Revelation. I'm talking about, the book of Job wasn't Jewish, even though it was held by the Jews and passed on to us. Job wasn't a Jew, and Adam and Eve were not Jews. God chose the Jews through Abraham for a specific purpose, but there are things about this story that are important to understand if you want to unlock the power of them for your own personal life. So the core story of the God story is unflappable, it's harmonious, and very creative and stimulating. I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment just about some of the ideas and misconceptions about the God story, but that whole idea that it's unflappable, harmonious, and creative and stimulating, that makes it more than just a passing on of information. The second thing that I love about these woven threads of truth is that they unfold over thousands of years, but it's clearly pinned together. I mean, when Jesus shows up, the Bible makes it really clear that the Son created the world and that Jesus is the Son. So that's the major thing that's pinned together, but everything is. The nature of man, the nature of God, the nature of life. We'll talk about that. So right along with that, in woven threads of truth, the Bible or the God story precedes the earth and time. Okay, and continues beyond the end of time. So it goes all the way back and before, and then it goes all the way to the end and beyond. And I think that's really remarkable. I mean, how do you even, in only 67,000 hyperlinks, how do you tell a story that does that? I don't know. And also, I think these woven threads of truth are relevant to all people, and also in every century. And I think that's amazing. I don't think that it's that Jesus is an English Jesus. In fact, he was Hebrew. He was from the Middle East. So I think Jesus, and I think the God story was given in a context that it could be accessible to the rest of the world. You might be sitting there and thinking, well, I don't know how he can trust the Bible like he does. And I think that's a fair point. I mean, I had my views of it, but then I started searching it, and now I've spent 45 years looking through it. So you be the judge. I mean, just because I have spent 45 years looking at it doesn't mean I didn't come at it with preconceptions, but I will tell you I didn't have any preconceptions. In fact, they were all kind of like the ones I'm going to talk about right now. One argument against these woven threads of truth is that you can make it say anything you want it to say. Have you ever heard this argument? It's applied in a lot of different situations. I think that is actually misleading. If you let the Bible speak for itself, if you allow these hyperlinks to interpret themselves, there's little wiggle room for what is meant inside of the God story. It just may take a little bit of work for us to discover it, and better the work happening without our preconceived ideas, which was good for me because I really didn't have much of a love affair with religion at all. So I was pretty much starting from scratch as I discovered God and moved forward with God. Second argument that I hear from people is that, the Bible, the God story is way too complicated. And okay, I get that. Like I mentioned before, the book of Leviticus, how it's inscrutable in a lot of ways, apart from its context. But I can actually tell you the entire story of the Bible in 10 minutes. And I may do that, the next time that we're together. Just in 10 minutes, I can tell you the entire story. And then with another 15 minutes, I can cover all of the content in its context. And so, yeah, I had to work at that, but my point is that the Bible is not too complicated. It's inscrutable in some ways, particularly if you're not willing to dedicate to yourself to it at all. So usually I think these and other arguments mean I'm too busy or I'm too lazy, that's who I was, to check it out myself. Or, and I run into this from an excuse perspective more often than not, I consider myself above things like the Bible, like the God story. And part of that is because a lot of people have no intention of buying into a story which may introduce accountability into my story. Does that make sense? And I think there's an antipathy with the Bible that isn't just religious, it's very human. And it goes right down to the core of God saying, this is who you are, this is who I am, and us saying to God, who do you think you are? So just a thought as you think about these woven threads of truth. I think there's a lot of propaganda and you have to wade through that just like I have. Actually, there's no human or group of humans that would ever write a collection so unflattering to humanity. Think about that. Why in the world would you write a book about humanity and say that everyone is lost, all are destined for obliteration, and that if God himself doesn't intervene, nothing is going to reverse this inevitability or this catastrophic ending that appears to be right around the corner? So, when I look at those 67,000 hyperlinks and I think, whoa, that's like way complicated, but it's not. That what I've discovered is that there are about a dozen or so major woven threads with hundreds of attachments, which is what that diagram revealed to me when I was looking at it. And those dozen or so major woven threads have lots of attachments to them, and they're being amplified as this incredible hyperlinked book unfolds, and it adds texture and color to the story. So that makes me think about some of the transcendent, traversing questions that are addressed in the God story, which, what kind of courage does it take to take on some of the great questions of life? Who's our Father? What are his purposes? What is wisdom and how can we find it? Who is the Son, Jesus? Who is the Holy Spirit? Who is man, really? What's the bad news? What's the good news? What is the meta story or the big story in which we find ourselves? How do we search for and find meaning? And then right along with that, in what ways do science, philosophy, and faith fit together, which the Bible, the God story, talks about that a lot. So when it comes to examining woven threads of truth, which is kind of the subject that we're talking about today, and I don't know, maybe this is kind of putting you in up to your neck, but it does really relate to a philosophical and a scientific and a faith look at who I am and who God is. And as I examine these woven threads of truth, I ask myself questions. And this is really carried over. I wasn't much of a question asker, or if I was, it was all from a very self-centered perspective. But what I've learned to do is ask questions more from a bigger or broader perspective, more of a philosophical perspective. And so these are some of my questions that I ask about examining woven threads of truth. First of all, what data is actually there? What data is present? And how is it revealed in the word pictures and in the overall story that is there? So if I start asking questions about what is actually there, that's been helpful in my examination of the process. Second thing, what is the story and what did it mean to those who were hearing it and experiencing it at the time? One of my favorite stories is when the woman who was caught in adultery was dragged into the temple treasury, and that's a whole story in and of itself by the religious leaders, and they accuse her, and kind of she's thrown down at Jesus' feet, and they start to trap Jesus, and Jesus gets down and he writes in the dirt. And as he writes in the dirt, one by one, in fact, he looks up and he says, "Let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone," and he keeps writing. And one by one, this group of expert religionists, oldest to youngest, which I think is interesting, they filed out and they all left. Now, who knows? Did that take a minute? Did they take 5 minutes? Did they take 20 minutes? Did it take 30 minutes? We don't know. But it happens, and Jesus looks down at the woman and says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "Nowhere." And he basically says, "I don't condemn you either." And man, what an emotional story. Think about the people involved in that story. Think about all the people who feel like that woman feels. Think about all of the people in history who have had encounters with Jesus where they've experienced that kind of grace and that kind of acceptance. And then think about the religious people of the world that come across that and either can go, "Yeah, that's me. I'm a Pharisee." I mean, that was real liberating to me a number of years ago when I thought, I can't sit here and talk about what dirtbags these people were. That's who I am apart from Christ in me. So looking at a story and what did it mean to those who are hearing it and those who are in the story, that can be very powerful when you're trying to unlock it. Next thing, what impact does each story bring to any person in any century and to me and anybody who wishes to know God? So you basically are looking at the woven story, you're saying what's going on in it, how did the people experience what was happening in the middle of it, and what does it have to do with my life? So back to the woman caught in adultery, is there anything that's not forgivable by God? Is there anything that Jesus was unwilling to approach? What did he say to the woman? "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and sin no more." So there's just so much life in the Bible, and I use that one example, but that's one of, 1,000 stories in the midst of these hyperlinks that if you throw yourself into them, all of a sudden there are incredible animations that come from it. So first hyperlinked text, the God story, 63,000, etc., cross-references. The whole idea of DNA folding and complex order and how this is really one woven story. It's not two testaments. It's not stories about disparate stories. It's really a story about the same God and the same people all the way through. And we started this whole conversation talking about imperfection, and that's the context of the Bible. And turbulence, that's the context. And suffering, that's the example of Christ. And then we also talk about reward, which is the hope of the God story that's being talked about. And you put all that together, and you have to ask yourself, and I ask myself, and I continue to answer and ask and answer, has God spoken? Has God spoken? And so not only do I feel like God is the master storyteller, I feel like he did it on purpose. I feel like he did it in a way to make it accessible to any human being who was ever born, who would ever live. And I contemplate this about the God that's revealed in this hyperlinked text, and I go, oh my goodness, is God really big enough to be in touch with 8 billion souls at one time from every country, every nation, every part of the world, let alone all the people who have lived and have died? I don't know. What do you think? I think it's worth thinking about.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. You can find posts and podcasts on tons of subjects at fourthstream.com, along with encouraging music which can be shared by a variety of ages. Finding hope at fourthstream.com.